In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. I'm so glad that you're listening in to today's episode. We're starting a series here for the month of October, and I guess the first week in November as well, on politically themed episodes, because this is an election cycle. We are going to be dealing with political issues, and so I'm excited. Today we're going to be talking about third-party candidates, or rather I should say if voting for a third-party candidate is a wasted vote. So let me start off by first saying that we won't be specifically addressing the candidates because we do fall under a 501c3, so we can't endorse or I guess harshly criticize, or I have to go back and check, political candidates. So in order to retain our 501c3 status, we're sticking to issues. And whether we should vote for a third-party candidate or not, or rather that it might just be a wasted vote, that's an issue. That's an issue that academics think about. And so we're going to be today shortly joined by Nick Byrd, who's a PhD candidate at Florida State University. He studies a number of issues. He's at the Moral and Social Reasoning Lab and in the Philosophy Department at Florida State. His primary research is about how people reason and how reasoning is related to ideology, morality, and philosophy in general. So we're excited to have him and his thoughts on today's show. He's going to be talking about something that he's written on and he's researched about third-party voting. His website, if you want to check him out, is byrdnick.com. That's byrdnick.com. But before we bring him on, we've just got a few introductory matters. This past week, we ran a giveaway on Veracity Hill's Facebook page. So if you don't already, please go over to that page and like us. That's a great way for you to get some feedback and some announcements. Great way for you to give some feedback and to listen to some announcements here. So let me get to the winners here of this book giveaway. So we were giving 3 copies away of this book. For those on Facebook Live, you can see which book we were giving away. It's called Good Faith, Being a Christian When Society Thinks You're Irrelevant and Extreme by David Kinnaman, who's with Barna, and Gabe Lyons, who runs an organization called Q. So the winners of the book are Seth Baker, Evan Olson, and John Hernandez. So those are the 3 winners. And if you're listening, if you want to secure the book that one of you 3 just won, you've got to respond back to me so I know where to send it to. So if you do not respond back to me in a week's time, then we will be giving it away to another person. So hopefully you're listening to the podcast. And I think we're going to keep doing this from time to time, have these giveaways. It's a great way to get the word out about what we're doing. So thank you for those that did participate, and stay tuned for future giveaways in the future. Last night, I had the pleasure of attending the Illinois Family Institute's Faith, Family, and Freedom Banquet, and the guest speaker there was former Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, and she gave a very impassioned message about the role that we have to play in our society, almost regardless of your partisan views. There's still important roles that we as Christians have to play in our society today. So maybe that's something we'll be talking about with Nick in a little bit, about the role that Christians have to play, or whether or not they're satisfied with the candidates this time around. And again, we're going to maybe be speaking generically about the candidates, but it may possibly slip, if we bring a candidate's name in, and we will speak objectively about that. So I want to share something that I found humorous. I shared this on my personal Facebook page, and perhaps this is something that you've been familiar with, or you've heard this as well in this election cycle. So just to provide a context here, so this comes from a Facebook page called Being Libertarian, and it's in, of course, their page is going to be supporting Gary Johnson. who's one of the third-party candidates this election cycle. And it reads, "Attention all eligible voters. Some very important news has come out regarding ballots in November. Please help spread the word. If you are planning to vote for Donald Trump, according to President Obama, a vote for Gary Johnson is a vote for Donald Trump. Therefore, when you get into the ballot box, look for Gary Johnson/William Weld and select them to lock in your vote for Trump. If you are planning to vote for Hillary, according to Donald Trump, a vote for Gary Johnson is a vote for Hillary Clinton. Therefore, when you get to the ballot box, look for Gary Johnson/William Weld and then and select them to lock in your vote for Hillary. If neither Trump nor Hillary excites you, there is a great option in Gary Johnson, and therefore, when you get into the ballot box, lock for Gary Johnson/William Weld." So you get the picture here. So they're making a play. This is the Facebook page, Being Libertarian. They're making a play off of what we get from both major parties. It's that, well, if you vote for the other person, you're really voting for, if you vote for Johnson, that's a vote for so-and-so, the opposite person. So it's really fascinating. This is really a social, psychological phenomenon that we are experiencing this election cycle. And so we're going to be thinking about this on today's episode. And I hope that this can be a bit enlightening to you. Maybe you'll still end up disagreeing with some of the thoughts we've got. I would love to get your feedback, though. So if you wanted to write a comment or something, you could do that on the website at veracityhill.com or on our Facebook, or even you can tweet at me at veracityhill. Or if you want to come on the show today, you want to have your voice heard, you want to comment or ask us a question, give us a call. The number is 505-2-STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. So with that, one more final announcement. I'm very excited. After the show today, we're going to be having our first official Defenders Media monthly meeting. So even though we've been in existence for hasn't been a year yet, usually just the stuff has been back and forth with multiple people, but we're bringing the team, the wonderful volunteers that have helped the ministry and really. They are the oil for the machine that is Defenders Media. And so we're going to be coming together, eating some snacks, drinking some pop or water, enjoying our time together, and then getting down to business, talking about ways we can help each other and the things that the ministry is doing. So if you want to learn more about our ministry, you can go to defendersmedia.com. Okay, so with that, I want to bring Nick in and start the conversation here. Again, Nick Byrd, he is at the Moral and Social Reasoning Lab and in the Philosophy Department at Florida State University. Nick, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Great. So I was just doing some Googling a few weeks ago and did a Google search third-party voting, and I'm pretty sure yours was like the fourth post or something that came up in my Google, and I thought, wow, this guy's got some thoughts on this, and he's got a well-made website, and I figured, hey, we've got to bring you on the show so we can talk about this stuff, because you've clearly invested some of your time into researching and considering the issues at stake here. So let me just throw it off with a very broad question. Do you think, and again, so I don't know if you've been listening, so we've got to keep it, if we have to use generic candidates, we can just come up with names for them. How do you feel about candidate R and candidate D? Is that still too conspicuous? Maybe we should do something like A and B.
A and B. Okay, I'll do A and B.
Sure, cool. Yeah. So, all right. So I'll just throw this broad question out there: Is voting for a third-party candidate a wasted vote?
Yeah. So that's a question that I think a lot of people will be asking this election, given that there's two candidates and they're extremely unpopular. So I think a lot of people are trying to think about ways that they can deviate from those two very unpopular candidates. Mm-hmm. I think there are ways to argue both ways, and I think it's going to depend on like who you align with most. Okay. And I think some people won't really align most with one of the two major candidates, and so they'll have to consider, do they want to vote based on who they align with, or do they want to vote based on like some sort of heuristic that tells you to vote for the majority parties?
So what do you? So let's draw that out a little bit. So there seems like there are a couple ways you could vote. One is to vote for the candidate that best fits with your own political ideology, or the heuristic vote, as you say, is what you think is maybe someone that you think could do a couple things for your view, and you think that they're electable, or rather that, well, we just can't have the other person. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so there could be all sorts of heuristics, right? So perhaps you've just been a member of one party your whole life, and so you just can't imagine voting for the other party. Or perhaps, you're surrounded by a community of people that talks very negatively of one candidate, like over and over and over again. So you've got this like severely negative association with one of the candidates, and so just based on that alone, you think, well, this person must be so bad that I just have to vote for the only other person who could beat them. And so that's another heuristic. And then there might be other types of heuristics that you could go to, but yeah, I guess the general point I was driving at is you could vote with these heuristics, or you could kind of take a step back and try to take a more reflective approach and try to like detach yourself from these quick, fast judgments that you could make and see, what is the evidence about where these people stand on various issues, and where do I stand on these issues, and like maybe reflect even on why you think you should stand in a certain place on certain issues. And when you do that, you might be able to find one way to vote based on alignment with issues, or alignment with a candidate based on issues, and that would be the more reflective, i.e., not heuristic approach.
Gotcha. So, why is it, do you think, that people say that if you vote for candidate C, we'll say that candidate C is the third party person, why would voting for candidate C be a wasted vote against somehow either A or B?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends on what people mean by wasted vote, right? So I think what most people mean is that you're voting for someone who doesn't have a chance to win. Mm-hmm. So that's maybe one gloss on what they mean by wasted vote. And so if that's what they mean, then it seems like what matters most is voting for someone who has a chance of winning, right? Mm-hmm. So then you might want to ask, is this a good reason to vote for one person over another? So do you mind if we kind of subject this to scrutiny right now, or do you want to?
Sure, yeah, we can get into it.
Okay. Yeah, so let's just take this thought to task here. So we say, look, we should vote for the person who's most likely to win. So let's assume we've got a candidate who's most likely to win, but it just turns out that candidate is Hitler. Now, I'm not saying that either of the candidates in this election are like Hitler, so please don't infer that. I'm just saying, imagine the one who happens to be most likely to win is Hitler. Surely we don't think that because that candidate is most likely to win, we ought therefore to vote for that candidate. And so it seems like on this gloss of the wasted vote, in which you think the people we should vote for are the people who are most likely to win, this voting to win strategy really breaks down, because we wouldn't want to vote for Hitler, right? And so then we would ask, okay, so why wouldn't we want to vote for Hitler? And I guess the idea would be something like, well, we don't really align with his plans or his policies about the future. And so, so the upshot here seems to be, oh, interesting. We seem to care more about whether or not we align with somebody's plans and policies more than we seem to care about voting for the person who's most likely to win. And so that's kind of just a brief, 4 or 5 step process of reasoning that you can run through to help yourself realize that this whole voting to win heuristic doesn't seem to bear out when it comes down to it.
And would you say so? I get the sense from what I've seen online is that, well, a lot of people that are supporting candidate C, they say, well, if you would just stop thinking, there are so many people, it's almost like a herd mentality. If so many people would just stop supporting A or B and would vote for someone that's more in line with their own political views, that then all of a sudden candidate C might actually have a chance at winning. Would you say that's accurate?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's really an empirical question, right? So, and unfortunately, it's an empirical question that would not be easy at all to measure in advance. It'd be the type of thing that we might be able to get some traction on after the election, perhaps. That assumes that most people vote. If there's an enormous amount of people who don't vote, and there historically has been, almost half of people don't vote in the U.S. And so, if that many people don't vote, then it makes it a lot harder to answer the question of if X number of people had voted for candidate C, then, some outcome would have happened, because there's so many people who just didn't vote at all that we didn't know what would have happened if those people would have voted and what that could have done to the election, right? So in general, I just want to say, like, that's a tough question to answer, and I think we would want data and lots of it, and even if we had the data, I'm not so sure that the answer would be clear.
Mm-hmm.
But, there is something to this idea that you're driving at, which is something that might be called the two-party problem, right? So,
yeah.
Historically, there's been two candidates that are most viable to win in any given election. So we've got essentially two viable options. And it might be that not everybody totally aligns with one of those two options, but for maybe a variety of reasons, they feel compelled to vote for one of those two, maybe for the voting to win strategy, or for other reasons that I guess we could discuss.
Sure, yeah.
But the point is, you only have two viable options, and you think, okay, so there are millions of people in this country, right? And I bet a bunch of them are really smart, really competent, really capable, and could do great things. How is it that at the end of the day we can only get two? And there's some political science on this. So there's this guy, Duverger. I don't know how you say his name, to be honest, but Duverger.
Mm-hmm.
And he basically says, look, the way our political system runs with the what's called the first past the post system,
mm-hmm.
that's likely to favor just two candidates.
So that's where the first past the post. That's just where one.
Yeah, go ahead.
One voter gets one vote, right? As opposed to like a weighted system where you could have multiple votes.
So the first past the post system is where, basically, once you get over a certain threshold of votes for a certain state, then that state gets all of the, say, electoral points.
Okay.
For that state, as opposed to just the percentage of votes that they got for the state. And then there's this there's this nested layer of another first past the post at the national level, where the first person to get past a certain number of total electoral points basically wins the election, even if they didn't get the majority of. So
that would be our system with the Electoral College.
Correct, yeah. So the Electoral College has this kind of first past the post feature at the state level, and it has this first past the post feature at the national level, and those are related. And basically, because people, or candidates rather, get points towards their being elected as a function of just getting the majority of the state and then the majority of the nation, because of the Electoral College, that means that people will vote for the two most likely candidates to win. It's just kind of the way it works. And there are other systems of voting where you could get more viable options than just two, but basically the way it works in the U.S., we're going to get two candidates that are wildly popular among the rest. So
that's, the two-party system. But, of course, the solution to that is have more parties, perhaps, right?
Good, yeah. Right. So the next step is to think, well, couldn't we just get more parties? And, the truth is, we've had more parties for a long time. And they historically have not really had much of a following. Mm-hmm. At least not in terms of votes. They might have a following throughout the election, but when it comes time to vote, the amount of votes they get tend to be pretty insignificant.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be a variety of reasons, like incentive structures that kind of maintain that status quo. For instance, in order for a third-party candidate to be in a debate, a third-party candidate has to show that they have a certain amount of support by a certain date, and if they don't get that amount of support, then they don't show up in the debate, and there's one less face on the stage, so to speak, to receive support. So this is something that candidate C has complained about, and other candidate C's in years past have complained about.
Sure. Yeah, just really any third-party candidate seems to have complained, that A and B seem to get more media attention than other C's, D's, E's, and F's.
Yeah, and so there's this real question of hey, what would happen if basically anyone who had just 0.1% of the electorate, if anyone who had just that much support could be on the debate stage, what would that do to the election?
Sure. And
again, I think that's an empirical question, and we wouldn't know until we kind of experiment with that. But you might think, well, what's the harm of experimenting with that? So you might think, maybe we should do something about this.
Mm-hmm. So if we've got that so-called two-party problem, but then there's also the third-party problem, it seems, that they just can't seem to get enough traction. what do we do then? I mean, what happens if we just continue in a system where A and B just generically are just candidates that continue to be wildly unpopular? How can we fix the issue? That it seems like a systemic issue, right? It's an issue with the system, and because it would keep reoccurring. So how can we approach that and try to come up with solutions?
Well, good. So I don't want to necessarily claim that, like, hey, look, this election we can turn things around and the third party can win. Totally likely. I would say that, the best modeling shows that, like, there actually is a chance for candidate C to disrupt the Electoral College enough to prevent either of the two major candidates from getting to 270 electoral points. That is a mathematical possibility, but it's it's pretty unlikely. So I just want to be honest about that.
So let me, for our listeners, let me just explain how that would work. So the American system is based off of the Electoral College, where the states, or there are electoral voters. These are actual persons that go in and vote, and it's usually the case that they vote in alignment with the state that they are representing. Although rarely has it occurred that an electorate or elector would vote against that. At any rate, so in America, you've got to get, as the present numbers stand, you have to get 270 electoral votes to win to become the president. But if there's a third party candidate that comes along and takes away some electoral votes because this candidate wins some of the states, that would prevent candidate that very well could prevent candidate A or B from achieving that 270. And then you've got an interesting case where what happens is the House of Representatives then vote for the president. But it's not just a simple majority in that either. They vote collectively based on on their states. So each state gets one vote. So in that vote, California gets an equal amount of votes to, say, Wyoming, even though California has vastly more people than Wyoming. So it's really an interesting system. It's not just simple majority. Some people think it's flawed. Some people think, hey, these are the checks and balances. So it's a quite fascinating system in that respect. But go ahead, continue, Nick, with what you were saying.
That was actually a really helpful kind of explanation of the system. I really appreciate that, actually. That'll clarify the discussion quite a bit, I think.
Thank you. Thanks.
So to give an example of what you're talking about, so like in 1968, here I'm pulling from an article that you sent me that was on C. In 1968, George Wallace was running as a third-party candidate, and he did receive 9 million votes and a total of 45 electoral votes. And that was almost enough to prevent either of the two major candidates from getting to that threshold that they needed to win the election. So if George Wallace had received a few more votes, then that would have prevented one of the two major candidates, either of the two major candidates, from having enough to get the election, and it would have gone to this secondary voting mechanism that you mentioned,
which has occurred.
So, that's not like an
yeah, that
has.
Sorry,
I just want to say it's like not an endorsement of George Wallace or anything, but it's just an example from history of how that could work.
Yeah, and that did happen in American history. I'll have to just double check here. It looks like 1801 and 1825. The House of Representatives voted for the candidate, and one of the times I even think they voted for the second place winner, as in the person with the second most electoral votes. So I think one time they voted for the top electoral vote getter, but then the other time it was the second place person. So for people that say it's impossible, I mean it's not impossible. It's just very improbable, but it has happened. So it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, that's definitely worth mentioning. Apparently you can't say it'll never happen or it hasn't happened, because that's
right.
False.
Yep.
Okay, so you're asking, like, what do we do about the two-party problem? What do we do to get the third party more votes? And so, I mean, here's an option. It seems like there are a variety of reasoning strategies that people use that lead them to vote for one of the two major parties, even though they don't prefer one of the two major parties. So the voting strategies that we talked about are the ones that I mentioned earlier. So like the voting to win, that seems to push people to vote for one of the two major parties, even if they don't align with the party that they end up voting for, at least not aligning as much as they align with, like, say, some other candidate.
Sure.
So that's one way that people do it. Another way that people do it might just be like a general kind of conformist experience. Like, all the people in their community are kind of putting social pressure on them, intentionally or unintentionally. They're putting social pressure on them to vote for one of the two major candidates. And so, when you think about how can we get more third-party votes, one idea is just, hey, let's just challenge ourselves to not fall into one of these two strategies where we either try to just vote to win or just try to conform to what our community is trying to get us to conform to.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not enough to just say, like, well, I'm just not going to vote that way, right? You have to say, I'm not going to vote that way, and instead, I'm going to vote this way, right? You have to have some sort of, like, positive strategy. So one strategy is what I call, like, just voting to align.
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty intuitive, right? What you do is you try to figure out where you stand on a variety of issues. So you might look at, like, say, 50 or so of the issues that have come up in the last year of campaigning, I guess over a year of campaigning, and try to figure out where you stand on all these issues. And hopefully your reasoning process about each one of these issues would not be one of the heuristic processes I was talking about earlier. Like, hopefully it would be the type of thing where you kind of take a step back and try to look at evidence in support or against each of these stances on each of these issues, and then try to take a stance, right? So you take a stance on all these issues. Step one. Okay, so then step two is you figure out where each candidate stands on each of these issues. And you notice the order here. You didn't start by looking at where candidates stand. You started by looking at where you stand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe that's impossible at this stage in the election because people have, like, I don't know, watched the news or something. But anyway, the idea would be figure out where you stand first, and then sort of, like, try to keep a blind eye to where the candidates stand so that you can have, hopefully, a less biased approach to the third step.
Right.
So after you look at where the candidates stand, you go to this third step and you compare your stances to their stances.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just, you basically figure out, okay, so I align most with candidate A, and I align second most with candidate B, and I align third best with candidate C. And then you vote accordingly. So there are websites that allow you to do this. So I think procon.org is one of them. And just kind of as an example, I did this during the primaries.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a very insightful afternoon for me to kind of work through all these issues and then come to my positions and then compare to the existing candidates. At that time, there was far more candidates then than there are now.
Sure.
But, it gave me a ranking. And then as people started falling out of the race, I just realized, like, okay, so that means that I can't vote for that person and I can't vote for that person. And now I have a new top alignment candidate on my list.
And the big benefit to doing this is that you mentioned you're not going to be as biased. So certain things that may lend themselves to bias, to be a bias, would be maybe something like, well, is that candidate handsome? Is he good looking? Does he look good on camera? Is he a good public speaker? For some, it might be whether the candidate is a male or female. Correct me if I'm mistaken. So by taking a test perhaps yourself, or just first figuring out what it is you believe about how you think the government should be run, regardless of the level, if it's like the federal level or a state level or if it's a local issue, you need to first figure out where you're at before you come to these candidates that you want to represent you. Is that right? Yeah. I think that's a very important step to kind of figure it out for yourself, as opposed to trying to figure out where other people stand and then trying to align yourself to them, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That would be the opposite of what you're trying to do. Yeah. Okay, so that's so step one is like looking at what you believe. Step two is then remind us again.
Yeah. So step two is then after you've figured out where you stand on a bunch of issues, you somehow find out where the candidates stand on these issues. And like I mentioned, procon.org, I think, is one of the places you can do this pretty easily. You basically just take like a 50-item test and indicate your position on a bunch of different issues, and then it gives you this output. It says, hey, look, here's the remaining candidates, and here's the people that you agree with most in a list. So it starts with the people you agree with most down to the list. At the end of the list is the people you agree with least. And that would be one way to vote.
Okay, so
you just vote for the person who you align with most.
And that's then the the pure option, finding the candidate that you think is is best. But suppose someone that's supporting candidate A or B says, well, but look, if you're still going to vote for candidate C, D, E, or F, the one that you may agree with, you're just throwing your vote away because that person doesn't have a chance. Does your approach then kind of depend upon everyone starting to just vote for the candidate that's most like them, would you say?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, so let's say somebody pushes back on this and say, look, like, I know you happen to align with candidate C most, but if you vote for candidate C is still not likely to win. And the upshot there is supposed to be, so you shouldn't actually vote for candidate C, even if you align with them most.
Yeah.
But that just goes right back to the objection we were talking about at the beginning, right? Look, the voting to win strategy turns out to be a bad strategy when it comes down to it, like in the Hitler case that we talked about.
Right.
Let's say they say the following. Forget about the fact that candidate C is not likely to win. If you vote for candidate C, that makes candidate A or B more likely to win, and the assumption there is that we don't want candidate A or B to win. Mm-hmm. So you're voting for candidate C is having some sort of bad outcome. Mm-hmm. But then we could go back to this opening remarks that he made about the Facebook post. I think that was actually a really good joke, right? So the joke is, look, there's a bunch of different statistical models that go both ways in terms of voting for third parties. Some models say, look, if you vote third party, it's going to end up being a vote for candidate A. And then there's other models that say, look, if you vote for a third party, that's going to end up being a vote for candidate B. So there's not quite complete agreement on what your vote does when you vote for a third party. Mm-hmm. Now, there's an important nuance here, right? Because we talked about the Electoral College a bit. There's this thing called a swing state, right? So these states where the chances of one candidate winning over another are more. I mean, it's neck and neck, right? So one candidate could win, the other candidate could win. It's not going to be a landslide, right? So the people who do decide to, instead of voting for a major party, and so if they decide not to vote for a major party, but instead to vote for a third party, those people maybe could have a significant impact in one of these swing states. Mm. So, historically, those swing states tend to be states like Colorado, Connecticut, Illinois, Iowa.
Ohio is the big one.
These are historical.
Yeah. Ohio's the big one, yeah.
Ohio's a big one. Florida's a big one right now. So there's a bunch of other ones. So if you're in one of those swing states, then there might be something to the argument that voting for a third party actually ends up being a vote in favor of one of the major two. Mm-hmm. So if you're in a swing state, that would be some research that you want to be doing. And here's another thing. If you don't have the time or the capacity, to do that kind of research, maybe don't vote or, consider not voting at least, because you just wouldn't know what your vote is doing, and therefore, you could unintentionally vote for this thing that you really wanted to not vote for.
Yeah, that's a good thought. Hey, so this has been a great discussion, Nick. If you have a question or comment on today's topic or a question for our guest today, you can give us a call. The number is 505-2STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. So, Nick, hey, let's continue this discussion after a short break from some of our sponsors.
Sounds great.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
This show is sponsored in part by Fox Restoration Incorporated, specializing in roofing, siding, gutters, windows, and remodeling of all types in the western suburbs of Chicago. Fox Restoration is locally owned, licensed, insured, and Better Business Bureau A+ rated. For more information or to schedule a free no-obligation consultation, visit www.foxrestorationinc.com or call 888-269-5113.
There's an easy way to be an informed voter. Visit ilvoterguide.com. ilvoterguide.com is a comprehensive online voter guide that rates the candidates on a 7-point scale from very conservative to very liberal. ilvoterguide.com lets you know where the candidates stand on life, taxes, and other key issues, who's funding the candidates' campaigns, and who's endorsing them. Before you vote, visit ilvoterguide.com. That's ilvoterguide.com.
Well, I am here with Nick Byrd, and today we are discussing the issue of whether voting for a third-party candidate is a wasted vote. And we're not specifically talking about the candidates on the show. Instead, we're speaking more generically about this issue. And so we've just sort of designated candidate A and B as your major party candidates, and C, D, E, F, G, etc. to the third party or fourth or fifth party type voting. But before we get back into that discussion, it is time for a segment of the show that we like to call Rapid Questions. And this is a segment in the show where we ask short, lighthearted questions, and we want fast responses. So, Nick, are you ready for Rapid Questions?
I hope so.
Okay, we're going to start the game clock, and we've got 1 minute. So here we go. What's
right.
your favorite sport?
Favorite sport? Running.
Left or right?
Left?
Taco Bell or KFC?
KFC?
Crushed ice or cubed ice?
Cubes.
Are you a morning or night person?
Morning.
Spring or fall?
Fall.
Beach or mountains?
Definitely mountain.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
No.
What celebrity are you most like?
I've told I look like Neil Patrick Harris on a daily basis.
Hokey Pokey, Electric Slide, or the Macarena?
Oh, Macarena, I guess.
And if you had to live anywhere, where would you want to live?
I really loved Colorado when I lived there, so I think Colorado is a great one.
A place to go back to, perhaps. Very nice. Well, thank you for playing Rapid Questions. Now, I know you're at Florida State right now, and you likely didn't know this, but that's where my wife is from, and her side of the family is still all there. So I'm quite familiar with Tallahassee. So you.
Oh, okay, cool.
Now, do you know, I wonder if it's still there, there's a Moe's Southwest Grill right across from the campus of Florida State, and it's my favorite Tex-Mex joint. Is that still there, or has it closed down?
That's a good question. There's definitely lots of Moe's, or at least a few Moe's around town.
Amen.
I'm guessing that one's still there.
Okay. All right. Well, we make about one trip there a year. So when we visit, and I love doing Moe's, because here in Chicagoland there didn't used to be Moe's, and then there was one like 30 minutes away. So I would make special trips just for Moe's, and then
wow. Yeah,
but thankfully there was one that opened up about 10 minutes from my house just probably a couple months ago. So the downside to that is, the household budget has now increased because visits to Moe's are a bit more frequent. So
yeah, they have some pretty good stuff, and they have that's the place that has the great like sauce bar or like
that's
different
right.
types of salsas, right?
Yep, and they include
they
include
pretty good
chips.
Stuff.
They include chips with a burrito free of charge, unlike their rivals who shall remain nameless.
Okay.
Cool.
Free of charge.
That's right. Okay, so we're talking about, here on the show today, we're talking about whether casting your vote for a third-party candidate is a wasted vote. And before the break, we explained a little bit about the American system. We talked about perhaps the inherent problems with the two-party system, such as, that you've only got two options. That seems to be inherent to the two-party system. And, of course, the way to break that is just have more parties. Well, that doesn't seem to be working all that much because people are still voting, for a candidate that they think is the lesser of two evils. And of course, this is the case not just this election cycle, but we've seen this, throughout American history, perhaps, because you only get one vote, and you don't want the worst or evil to come into office. So that may mean that you vote for a candidate that even still you don't like, and you kind of hold your nose, as some people say, that they're just going to hold their nose and cast the vote. But perhaps there are some other solutions to this, and then also maybe you waste your vote even in a two-party system. So we're going to bring that up, Nick, hopefully in this next half of the show, and we've even got some panelists here today. So we're going to be asking them some questions, or they've got questions as well. Let me just say here, we've got one commenter here who's listening to the show. They say, "Love me some Moe's, free chips." Yes, thank you. I agree. So glad we've got some Moe's supporters out there. We should see if they want to become a sponsor of the show. That's what we should see. Okay, so
it sounds like they're already getting the benefits.
Okay, Nick. So let's keep talking here. What else can we do if we want to try and help increase awareness of these third parties? Like you had mentioned, I mean, maybe voting this time around just won't do that much good. But is there a long-term game here? I mean, surely in the history of the states, we've seen parties evolve and change and new parties arise. Maybe that's kind of what's needed. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Good. Yeah. So I think that's a really good idea to think about the long view. So so you might think, look, my third party vote in this election won't likely allow the third party candidate to win. But what does that do in the grand scheme of things? And you might think, okay, so if more people who actually align with third party candidates vote third party, then that shows up in a data set somewhere. And if you're not aware, then current elections are very, very. There's like loads and loads and loads of polling about current elections, right?
Yeah,
including lots of people looking at that polling data, and political parties pay huge money to have access to this data, to analyze it in all sorts of ways, so that they can try to get as many votes as possible, right? So, if people who align with third party candidates express their third party vote, then that shows up in a data set, and then down the line, when parties are looking at how to recruit votes, they're going to have to appeal to those people who voted for third party candidates. And so, it is, I think, there is a sense in which it's extremely important for people who have third party leanings to express that, so it shows up on a data, on a spreadsheet somewhere, and gets looked at by people who want their vote.
Mm-hmm. And let me say here, so in the United States, we have a system where if any party gets more than 5% of the vote, they get access to matching funds from the federal government. And if I'm not mistaken, I'll have to double check on this. If I'm not mistaken, these aren't taxed dollars. These are dollars that people actually donate when they fill out their taxes. So I've got to double check that. At any rate, though, so these parties can receive these federal funds. So for a third, fourth, or fifth party that really needs money to help expose their views, to make voters aware, hey, we exist, getting to that 5% threshold of a general vote is quite crucial. And that can be a benefit, too, if you're unsatisfied with the two major parties, because you might think, well, let's get some more competition. Let's let there be more competition of ideas. Let's let there be more candidates. So that would be one way to do it, is by casting your vote for the third party, because you're going to help them get to those thresholds, which will provide benefits. So now, Nick, before we continue, I want to bring the panel we've got some questions we might be able to ask to you, since you're a great resource for us. So here in studio, we've got our team. We've got Chris and Joel, the two main tech guys, and we've also brought in our code master, Kevin, and they're all joining us today. And Joel, you had a question about whether you could waste your vote in a two-party system. What was your thought on that?
So I was just saying that there are really, well, if you think about it statistically, voting for candidate A, let's say, that they're going to take your state, So a certain amount of votes over when they tip the state towards themselves is a wasted vote too. Is that true?
Yeah, so there's a discussion of that, I think. So there is a sense in which, let's say you just have to get 50% of the vote to get the electoral votes for a state, right? So any votes over that 50% mark are, in a sense, wasted, right? Because they, if those votes weren't there, then the candidate still would have gotten the 50.1% or whatever that they needed for the state. And so all those votes are wasted. And in a state like California, that's millions of votes. So, California is like 95% leaning towards one candidate. And so that would mean that, roughly 44% of the people who vote, which again is millions of people, their vote didn't actually help their candidate win the election, because if those votes weren't there, their candidate still would have won the election. So there is that sense. And so I think I'm really glad that point's being brought up, because it kind of shows another problem with this idea of voting to win, right? Because if you think you should only vote for candidates when your vote makes them more likely to win, then this means that in a state like California, millions of people just shouldn't vote. And that seems like a bad conclusion, which points out that, maybe this idea of this notion of a wasted vote is actually not a good one.
Well, so maybe let me push back on that. So what if they said, or someone said, well, but we have to assure the victory of the candidate, because, getting to if the final vote totals are, and the winner gets 50.1%, whew, that was a close call. So you want to try to avoid those close calls, and you instead should then support candidate B over A, right? So shouldn't we still say that, well, we should support the lesser of two evils because we have to assure or be assured that victory will occur? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so I think there is something to that, right? So let's say, we told, there's like a massive public service announcement to California, and we said, look, millions of you don't have to vote, just stay home that day. We haven't told which people not to vote, and that would be very important, right? Yeah. We would need to tell exactly the right million amount of people, or a few million, to not vote. And only if we told the exact right people and all of those people perfectly complied would it still work out, right? So if we just sent this public service announcement to the whole state, then most people don't show up, and all of a sudden the other candidate somehow miraculously wins. Right? So there is some sense in which the logic doesn't perfectly break down, because as game theory sort of suggests, this is a very complicated matter, right? You're not just voting in a vacuum, you're voting amongst many others, and so you have to kind of take into account, what are they going to do if I do vote this way, or don't vote at all, or vote this other way? So yeah, I think there is something to this point of pushing back, saying, I'm going to vote for this person anyway, even though it didn't, strictly speaking, guarantee that the candidate would win. It's just kind of creating an extra cushion for the candidate.
Right.
And I think there's actually a second point that you can kind of make about this. Look, the more support that this candidate gets in general, the more powerful they will be when in office, right? Because then they'll be able to say things like, look how much of the vote I got, folks. So that when they're trying to push for a certain policy or something like that, they can say, I didn't just get 51% of people to stand behind me. I got, way more than that, or something like that. So there's a sense in which it's not just, it doesn't just matter for the election. It has this more long-term effect. This long-term effect down the road for the candidate to be able to speak to their base.
Definitely, yeah. I think that just highlights that the idea of a wasted vote is not a good idea.
or perhaps better yet, Joel, let me restate that a wasted vote occurs on both sides, so that if you might think you're wasting your vote, or some people might think you're wasting your vote if you cast it for a third party, whereas at the same time those people supporting the third or fourth or fifth party candidates would say, well, actually, no, you're wasting your vote because so and so is going to win in a landslide in that state, so why bother? You might as well vote for someone that's more pure. I know in this election season, I've sort of used that line of reasoning to illustrate to some people saying this phrase, because I want them to understand, oh, well, perhaps it's a wasted vote on both ends, apparently, right? Because as we've been saying, the state of California, if you're going to win in a landslide, it may not be California either. It could be other states that are firmly in support of one candidate or the other, and you see this over a long period of time through these election cycles. But so really then in those non-swing states, maybe people should be more willing to vote for someone that's more ideologically pure. Let me phrase it that way. So, Kevin, you've got a comment or question.
Yeah, at least for the minority party in those states, because they're going to lose anyway. When you're dealing with the majority party, if the amount of votes gets low enough, they could actually lose.
Yeah.
But the minority party is really wasting their vote in these solid states that are totally, predicted who's going to win.
Wait, say that again. So you're saying the minority party is wasting their...
Absolutely, yes.
I see. So you're saying, so if candidate A is going to win a state, the people
by
voting...
By a large margin,
then candidate B...
Everybody who votes for B...
is also wasting their vote.
They're the primary people who are wasting their vote, and they should vote for a third party.
Right, and yet it would be more powerful to vote for
Absolutely, yeah. Not only is it important for them to vote for a third party, it's important for them to vote and separate themselves from the apathetic people who aren't going to vote no matter what.
Huh. Interesting. So now, Nick, could you tell us then, how would that be different from the swing states? So the swing states are, for those that aren't following politics all that much, swing states are states where you have one candidate, you have the party A wins one cycle and party B wins the other cycle, and it can go back and forth, hence it swings like a pendulum. So does that then also apply to these swing states, or what's going on there?
Yeah, that's where things get very complicated. So a lot of people will say, look, if you don't vote for if you vote for candidate C instead of one of the major two, then you're actually voting for, and then they insert the name of one of the major two candidates. But that is based on a variety of assumptions. Namely, it's based on what your second most likely candidate you would vote for is, and what your third most likely candidate that you would vote for is. And until you know those second and third for each person, it's not clear which way a third-party vote would swing things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I recommended that people kind of really try to carefully look into, if you're in a swing state, really try to look at the most respectable polling for that state and try to understand what your third-party vote is doing. So there's a variety of lists of third-party states that you can find. I think even Wikipedia has one. I'm honestly not entirely sure what to make of what a third-party vote is going to do in each swing state.
Yeah, and even in those states that aren't super solid, we've got Travis here. He asks a question, doesn't talking about the 50.1% seem superfluous when it presupposes who the winner's going to be? Because maybe you don't know who that winner's going to be if it's a close race. Perhaps that's a good point, that we still don't know, right? It's as you said, Nick, it's sort of that empirical thing that you only discover after the fact. That's right. What makes it an interesting phenomenon.
But that's
yeah, and
swing
I guess
states. But
go ahead.
That's true in swing states, but in a lot of states you do. I mean, there's enough statistical evidence in the last, let's say, 20 years of elections to know where it's going to go.
For those long term. The long-term outlook. With the short-term outlooks that change, those are the ones where it kind of is more important. And so even then, I don't know what I would do. So I live in a solid state. So I don't, if I lived in a swing state, I imagine people feel the burden more as to who they should vote for. Because, back in 2000, the difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore was, 537 or something like that votes out of millions and millions, tens of millions of votes. That's, that was the difference. It's like 1/100% or something, or probably more than that. It's just quite.
You have to look within each state.
Yeah. It's really in our system with the Electoral College. You have to look into that. So, we do have a question from someone here online. Nick, we'll start with you, and then I'd like to get the thoughts of the panel here. So Bob writes, listening right now. Here's a question. What if you lack confidence in the candidate following the party platforms? So I guess perhaps Bob here is wondering, so you've done step one, right, Nick? You've done step one. You found out where you believe, what you believe, and you've done step two in the sense that you follow a party. Maybe you don't follow a candidate, but you follow a party. And what if, and perhaps this poses an interesting question, because there's perhaps a good argument to be made that in this cycle, none of the candidates seem to follow their platforms, perhaps. maybe there's a discussion there. But at any rate, so what do you do then? What would your advice be, Nick?
Yeah, that's a really good question, right? And I really appreciate that the person's thinking, it's like an extra step of reflection about this process, right? So, because there are multiple more steps you could make beyond the, 3 or 4 that I've recommended. So I do think you want to consider, okay, so, allegedly this person is committed to this party, or maybe they're committed to this issue, but then you think, okay, they said that, but based on a variety of contextual factors like their history on this position, or how seriously you can take them based on the things they've said during the campaign. How seriously are they committed to this issue, or how seriously are they really committed to this party? Mm-hmm. And if you're not confident in that, then there is a sense in which you want to discount the impact that has on your decision, that their belonging to a party has on your decision, or their taking a certain stance on an issue has on your decision.
Yeah, no, that's good. Before I give my thoughts, anybody here from the panel have thoughts on what we should do when a candidate that is representing your party does not seem to support what your party believes? What do you do then? So you guys have any thoughts? No? Okay, well, then so I've got some thoughts on that. Nick, I think you're right. It sort of creates this distrust that perhaps this candidate is just doing lip service, right, to the views. Maybe even he or she, maybe the candidate says that they will do something, but you just don't find them trustworthy, and you just don't believe that's what they're going to do. Maybe that's an opportunity for you to look at other candidates that might be closer to your policy position. So maybe even the other platform does not or is not as close to the previous party's platform, but you've got the candidate that is. And so maybe since that candidate's more trustworthy, you think you know what you're going to get, and so maybe that's why you should support that candidate, because with the philosophy of what's called populism, a candidate may just be telling the crowd what he or she thinks the crowd wants to hear. And that is one strategy that politicians take. So it may not even be, it may go against their personal beliefs. So the person say, oh, well, I'm personally opposed to, one common example is abortion. I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I still support a woman's choice, they say. So that's sort of that populism that you might see. And you also might see it in other cases, too. I'm not going to bring in some of the examples of the candidates that we see today, but I think we do see it. And we may even see it on both sides, but or multiple sides. Kevin?
I would say one thing about parties is that a president isn't president by himself. He or she appoints a lot of other people, and usually it's from the same party that they're running from. So you are kind of electing a party more than just one person. Certainly it'll be biased by that person. But sure. the Supreme Court justices that they elect, the cabinet that they put in there,
their staff even, because the staff does work.
Who advises them? Yeah,
right, or even the staff does work on behalf of the president, but it may not be even precisely what the president wants. But like you said, it still represents the party. So there are a lot of factors at play, in this topic. We're getting a little low on time here, Nick. So. What would you say then? Does it depend on the election cycle if a third-party vote is wasted? And what would be your advice then to people? And perhaps you can speak generically. What's your advice in this cycle?
Yeah, good question. So, I would stress again, if you live in a swing state, then you've got a lot of research to do on what your vote actually does, because, you can vote for one thing and then unintentionally shift the election towards this thing that you didn't want to shift it towards, right? So there's something to be said for doing a lot of research there. And I do think, there's this ethical question about voting. So Jason Brennan is a philosopher who talks quite a bit about the ethics of voting. Mm-hmm. And he has a variety of arguments that come to the following conclusion. It is worse to vote badly than it is to not vote. Meaning, if you aren't confident that you can't vote badly, or you're not confident that you will vote well, then it would be better to not vote. And, in swing states, it might be hard to figure out how to vote well. based on, how close these elections are, right? So I guess I would just encourage people to consider the possibility that, like, the best thing to do could be not to vote. I know it sounds kind of strange to a lot of people, but, like I said, Jason Brennan has lots of arguments for that if you want to check out his book called The Ethics of Voting. So that's one thing I would say. And then I would say if you're not in a swing state, I think the panel, some of the people on the panel have made this really great point. Like, look, if you're in California and 95% of people are going to be voting for this one candidate, and and the polls are pretty clear that that's what's going to happen, then you don't have as much likelihood of causing, say, an unintended consequence by voting for a third party or voting for whoever you most align with. And so there's a sense in which a person could feel more freedom and more comfortable and confident about voting for the person that they most align with.
Great. Awesome. Well, hey, Nick, it's really been great to have you on our show today. Thanks so much for your time. If you want to learn more and read about Nick's work, you can go to www.byrdnick.com. And so that's BYRDNICK.com. Thanks again, Nick.
Thank you, and thanks to the panel.
Of course. All right, so I hope this has been an enlightening discussion for you guys, and this perhaps is because it's such an outlier of an election cycle. That's what makes this topic, I think, really interesting to talk about. In past years, there's still always been that discussion, especially I know Ralph Nader's kind of been a guy that's always just been a part of that political discussion, but this time around, you've got a couple candidates, Jill Stein and Gary Johnson. I think it's because voters are so dissatisfied. I mean, the polls just show they're dissatisfied with the two major candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that this discussion, it becomes a bit more worthwhile. And so there's a lot to say here still on this, but I hope we've been able to provide insight for you, listener, for maybe some things that you've been thinking about. We do have a follow-up thought here. This is from Travis here. So he says, as a private voter, I have no knowledge of who that 50.1% is. So it's going to, he writes, it's going to be, so basically it's not going to be good for him to try and figure out who he thinks may win. So maybe to that, I'll just say, well, Travis, yeah, perhaps you live in a swing state, and so that can be hard to figure out. For some of us, the majority of us, I can even say, that live in states where it's a sure bet who's going to win, there will be some wasted votes, both on candidate A and candidate B, in whichever state you live in. That is a solid state, because you'll have votes on the top of the winner that are a waste, but then the other candidate that lost, whether it's A or B, those are also wasted votes because they didn't win. So perhaps in those states, you've got to think maybe I should find a candidate that is more in alignment with where I stand. And there was a topic we didn't get into all that much today. It was on sort of, we brought up a little the first past the post system, but also what other voting systems are there and how can those help? So I guess maybe we'll have to devote another episode to that topic in its own right. But I hope this has been enlightening for you. And I just want to say that I am grateful for the continued support that we have for this show, from our patrons to our sponsors. So the patrons are people that they chip in a couple bucks a month, $5, $10 a month, to help us do this show. And if you want to learn more about how you can become a patron and what benefits there are, there's some benefits there that you can read about on the website. I've got a texting program that I use. So if you're one of our $10 a month patrons, I'll shoot you out a weekly text message about what the show's going to be on before anybody else hears about it. So you'll get the insider updates. And I'll also take your questions as priority as well. So please consider that. And then our sponsors. So let me just list them here. We've got Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, and Fox Restoration. So we've got a growing list of sponsors. So thank you to our sponsors for your support. Thanks to the tech team, Chris and Joel, and to the full panel. That would also include Kevin today. Thank you to our guest, Nick Byrd, who's a PhD candidate at Florida State University studying philosophy and moral psychology. And thank you for listening in today and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.